Sup guys, Bjorn here. Today I have something very special queued up for you guys. We're gonna take a look at a complete guide on how to become a better raider. And we're gonna cover everything from attitude to performance to what to think about when joining a new guild to what add-ons you need to use, etc, etc. So stay with me here guys. Before we get into the video, you could always consider subscribing and liking because it's gonna help me a ton in making more of these videos, which is really what I wanna do. So thank you guys, and let's get straight into the video. Okay, so how do you become a better raider then? Well, there's obviously a lot of things to it, but the first thing I want to touch on, and arguably the most important thing, the one thing that I see most people fail at, and this is also the reason we usually kick people for, is attitude. You really need to have a good attitude towards raiding, towards the raid team, towards everything that is going on in there. And attitude obviously covers a lot of different things, but the first thing is that raid success goes above all else, right? It doesn't matter if you're doing top DPS, it doesn't matter how well you're performing if the raid itself is not succeeding. So sometimes you're gonna have to lose some DPS for the good of the raid, sometimes you're gonna have to do a lot of stuff you don't want to do for the good of the raid, and sometimes you're just frankly gonna have to give up a lot of personal stuff in order for the raid to succeed. And I think one important thing to mention here at the very start as well, when we're talking about this attitude and the raid success above all else, is that dying is very bad, right? Usually people excuse their deaths all the time in raid. This is one of the things I see the most, is that when someone dies they say, oh well, that was because I was using this DPS spell, or that was because I didn't have this defensive cooldown, or that was because I didn't do that or that, right? Or that was because I had to do this DPS here. And frankly, there's no real good excuse for dying, right? Obviously there's going to be some situations where you can't avoid dying, that's fine, but I'm just saying, if there was something you could do to avoid the death, it's probably a good thing to do that, right? It's way better to actually lose some DPS, to spend an extra defensive, or whatever it can be to survive, than it is to die and say, oh, I needed to die there, otherwise I wouldn't have gotten my DPS off, right? Because frankly, DPS is usually not that big of a deal unless you're at the very, very, very top end of the game. In most of our cases, dying is always bad and you should always avoid it. The next thing is to admit to mistakes, and this is also something I see a lot of people failing at, right? Our core reaction when we make a mistake is to be ashamed, right? We don't want to admit it, and we would rather keep silent and hope that no one notices it. But that is a horrible way to actually progress in a raid, right? Because if no one admits to their mistakes, well, first of all, it's going to create a very, very bad atmosphere where admitting to mistakes is not something that is seen as something you should do, right? And more importantly, it is making it extremely hard for the raid leader to actually figure out what's going wrong, right? Because all the raid leader wants to do, if he's a good raid leader, is to figure out what is going wrong in this raid and how can I fix it. So if you don't admit to your mistakes, if you don't tell him what's going wrong, then how the fuck is he gonna fix it, right? And sure, there's gonna be some bad raid leaders out there that won't admit to their own mistakes, they might flame people, they might not really want to solve the issues in a good way, but you yourself have to set the example by admitting to your mistakes. And I have a rule of thumb here. If you made a mistake, if you know within yourself that, hey, I fucked up here, I could have done something different, then you should speak up, right? You should say, okay, this death was my fault, I could have done that or that differently. But if something was not your fault, right? Someone else died and you couldn't have done anything about it, then you should not speak up, right? If something goes wrong and it's not your fault, then you speaking up will probably just hurt the overall raid, because what the raid leader wants is to hear from the people who actually did fuck up and hear why they did that and how we can change it. So if you made a mistake, admit to it and see what you can do to change it. If you didn't make a mistake, then just keep quiet and don't flame other people, don't try to help the problem if you don't know what's going on. That's just gonna lead to more confusion and more time spent on not raiding. Obviously, this works best if everyone actually admits to their mistakes, right? If you are the only one admitting to your mistakes and no one else does it, then you're obviously still gonna run into some problems, but it's always good to set an example. And sometimes you will also have to speak up when it's not your fault, right? If you're being falsely accused of something, or if you need to relay some form of information that is going to help the raid, even if it wasn't your fault, then you can obviously speak up even if it wasn't your mistake. But as a general rule, I think it's very good to follow that. The next thing is no tilting allowed. And tilting is incredibly hurtful to every single raid. I think the number one reason for a raid wipe is almost always tilt, right? Because tilt comes in whether we like it or not. I think everyone tilts to a certain extent. It's just about keeping that tilt contained, not letting it affect your gameplay or your mood. That's the biggest part, right? Because how tilting occurs is that some players in the guild are going to be a little bit better. They're going to be maybe a little bit more quick learners. They're going to perform a little bit better, and this can obviously change on a fight-to-fight basis, right? Some fights are easier for some people to comprehend. Some fights have very difficult jobs for some players, while some players are just AFK. So it's very, very important that if you're in a situation where you are maybe 1 hour into your raid, you have performed adequately, you've performed almost maybe perfectly up until that point, right? You haven't wiped the raid, you haven't died yourself or anything like that. And you are beginning to see that this is taking a while, right? A lot of people are making mistakes, a lot of people are dying to things they shouldn't die to, etc., etc. Then that indicates two things, right? First of all, you might be in a bad guild, right? You might just be in a guild that's below your level, and then you should obviously maybe look to improve the level of your guild or move to another guild eventually. But that doesn't excuse you for tilting in the current instance that you're in right now. So if you notice that, and you start to notice that you're beginning to tilt, a good way I usually deal with it is to put on some music, mute raid comms, just try to find a bit of flow, try to find a bit of peace, and don't focus on your angry emotions, don't try to speak up, don't try to somehow change the way things are going, because most of the time it's just simply the fact that some people take more time to learn an encounter than other people. The dangerous part if you tilt is that once you maybe are 2 hours into the raid now, and all of those players who struggled at the start have now learned the raid, and they are performing perfectly. They are actually playing very, very well. Now you are tilted, and you will be much more prone to making mistakes yourself. So even though you played very well for the first hour, for maybe the first half of the raid, now suddenly you're starting to make stupid mistakes. You're starting to die to one-shot mechanics. You're starting to stand in the wrong position because you are tilted. You're not really focused, right? And this is very, very dangerous. This is just going to lead to raids taking so long, because in the first half of the raid, all the bad players, or not the bad players, but the players who take a little bit longer to learn, they are gonna die a lot. And then in the latter half of the raid, all of the players who performed well in the first half are gonna be so tilted that they are just gonna start making a ton of stupid mistakes in the latter half. And those stupid mistakes lead to other people tilting, and it's just a vicious cycle. So the very, very most important thing, in my opinion, if you want to kill raid bosses quickly, is to not tilt. Tilting is horrible. Another thing I see very commonly in raid is people whispering the raid leader, and this can be for various reasons, right? But it's always bad. Do not whisper the raid leader. First of all, if you're whispering the raid leader to suggest a strategy, right? This is probably the most common thing. This is really horrible. First of all, the raid leader is already over encumbered with work. He's leading the raid, he's playing himself, he's dealing with all of the organizational stuff around it and outside it, right? Especially if he doesn't have good officers. That means that he is going to be very stressed probably while raiding. And if you whisper him during every single raid, and this is obviously worse the more people are doing it, he's just going to become so over encumbered with work that it's going to hurt the overall performance of the raid, it's going to hurt his raid leading, it's going to take a lot of extra time, because instead of actually saying stuff between pulls or setting up pull timers, doing consumables or whatever it is, in between pulls, the raid leader is going to be so busy answering all of these whispers that it's just going to drag on the raid a ton. So never ever whisper the raid leader under any circumstances, basically. I mean, obviously there's going to be extreme situations where you might need to, but I'm just saying, don't do it on a regular basis. If you want to suggest a strat, if you think that this strat we're currently doing is bad, then you need to speak up in either raid comms, raid chat, or just talk to a friend about it first, right? Because this is another thing I see very commonly. People are well intended with this stuff, right? They want to help the good of the raid when they're suggesting strats, but when random raiders are just suggesting strats all the time, it can also hurt the raid in the long term, because first of all, they might be misinformed. And this, I see this fairly often, right? The raid leader has probably done a lot of research on the raid. He knows what's going on. He's gonna know about things that are happening later in the encounter, or whatever it can be. While some raiders might just see the very, very immediate picture, right? If you're wiping at 68% and something needs to change, then a lot of raiders might think, oh, we should just do this and this and this, and then we'll easily get through this 68% block here. But the raid leader might know that, wait, 10% down the line, we're gonna need all of these things that we just used, so we actually should not change strats, we should just play better. And this can be really hurtful if a lot of the raiders in your raid are starting to suggest new strategies when they don't really know what they're talking about. So if you think that the strat needs to change, you should probably first be sure that you're well informed on the encounter. Then you should think through the strat very thoroughly, right? See if there's any holes in there, see if there's any things you haven't thought about. If you still think it's a good idea, then maybe even asking a friend in the raid, right? You usually have someone in the raid that you're maybe a little bit more close to than other people. You can ask them in either comms or just send a whisper to them or put it in raid chat or whatever, and see what other people think of the strat before you start suggesting it to the raid leader. Once you are extremely sure that this is actually a good thing for the raid, then you can maybe suggest it. Another thing that's very related to attitude is to make sure you listen to feedback in raid. And feedback can come from a lot of different sources, right? It can come from the raid leader, it can come from some other raiders, it can come from guides, from videos, whatever it is. But anything that can help you improve on the encounter is probably a good thing. I know it's pretty hard to listen to feedback sometimes. Sometimes you can feel attacked personally. Sometimes you feel like the people giving the feedback don't know your class, they don't know the encounter, they don't know what's going on. And there are those scenarios, right? There are scenarios where people will tell you something and you instantly know, hey, that's just not possible with my class or with my spec or with my current situation. And in that case, it's good to actually voice that opinion, right? But if someone is simply telling you like die less or please start doing more damage or whatever it can be, right? Then it's important that you just say, okay, I will try to do that, right? I will try to improve here, because if the raid leader or someone else is telling you, it's probably an issue for the entire raid. So we have the boring attitude stuff out of the way. We're moving on to performance, right? And this is where you guys want the juice stuff, I'm guessing. So the very first thing I think that you should do in raid is to work on your routine and establish a routine for every boss. This can take some of the enjoyment out of the game, I guess, for some people. So if you're raiding at a very casual level and you don't really care about improving that much, then this might be a step that you can skip. But if you want to improve, if you think that it's fun to perform as well as possible on every single encounter in terms of DPS or whatever it is that you care about, then establishing a routine for a boss can be extremely, extremely helpful. And you've probably already done this subconsciously or consciously before. What it basically means is that you will, over the course of the pulls, start to get into a groove of things you do every single time, right? So it can be, for example, you do a certain pre-pull for a certain boss, right? So you do a pre-pull, then you might know that, okay, in 10 seconds there's going to be some other mechanic going on, so I pre-move to some position with my movement globals in the first part of the fight. Then when that comes, I'm already ready, I'm already standing there, etc., etc., right? So you establish some form of pattern that you make sure to actually execute every single pull, and that will make you very consistent. It will improve your DPS, because if you're a DPS player, the point of this routine is mainly to actually make sure that you lose as little globals as possible to movement, to unpredictable stuff, to mechanics, or whatever it can be. Now, the further your guild or your raid progresses into the raid fight, the more you can add on to this routine, right? And eventually, when you're starting to get to the low pulls, you will hopefully have a nice sequence of events, of actions that you can perform every single pull. You know how to deal with a lot of the mechanics, and your pulls are starting to look very consistent. You can pull off the same damage pretty much every pull if you do this stuff. On the other hand, if you do wildly different things every single pull, it's going to be very hard to establish muscle memory. It's going to be very hard to evaluate what is actually good on a fight, what is bad, what your best actions are, and you're just going to also be very inconsistent. You're going to have those pulls where you did something that you never done before and you're real confused about it. Maybe you died because of it, maybe you didn't do a lot of damage because of it. However, even if you do have a routine that you're doing every single pull, trying stuff out in the first half of the raid can still be very helpful, right? Trying a different opener, trying a different second set of cooldowns, trying a different positioning or whatever it can be can still help you in the long run. I'm not saying to not try stuff out, but change one variable at a time and do it within your routine to achieve the maximum effect. Something you can do within your routine is to map out a good cooldown usage for the fight. And this is relevant for all classes, but mainly for DPS maybe. Now, every fight is going to have a duration, right? And there's going to be some different phases in that fight that value cooldowns differently. Now, the first thing to do is to make sure that you get the maximum amount of cooldowns in any given fight, right? So, for example, if the fight is 7 minutes long and you have 2-minute cooldowns, well, then you're going to get 4 uses out of those cooldowns, no matter what. The biggest thing there is to just make sure that they happen at the right times, right? And you have that 1 minute leeway as well at the end to space out the cooldowns better if you think that's necessary. Logs can help you a lot with both of these. How to use logs for this is to go to Warcraft logs, right? And then you will pick your spec, you will pick the boss that you're currently doing, and you will pick a parse that you think looks good. So things to keep in mind here is that maybe don't pick the absolute top parses, right? Because they will usually have a ton of like external cooldowns, PIs, whatever it can be. They will also probably have really good kill times, so their layout of the fight might be a little bit different. It's better to choose still a good parse, but one where the PIs, the externals, the fight time is a little bit more relatable to you. Once you go to that parse, you can see a timeline for every spell that they cast, and you can also see how many times they cast different spells, right? So sometimes logs and good parses will obviously come from padding or whatever, and in that case you might not want to follow this exactly, but it can still be a really good way to find out your optimal cooldown timings, for example, or to just help you with what to actually cast. Another big thing related to your performance is to think a lot about single target versus AoE, and this is especially important in Sanctum of Domination because in this raid there's a ton of bosses that have AoE phases with adds or whatever it can be that kind of needs to die, right? So when you see a ton of adds spawning or when you see a big AoE opportunity, it's very tempting to just send your AoE spells at it, right? And sometimes that's the right play, but sometimes it's also the wrong play. So when you think about single target versus AoE here, you've got to realize a few things. First of all, single target damage is usually pretty important in raids. Even if the boss is maybe an AoE fight or has some AoE phases, then actually killing the boss itself will always be somewhat relevant at least, right? And that means that you will want to optimize your AoE damage, right? Because some classes lose a lot of DPS if they start spending on AoE, while some classes don't really lose a lot of single target DPS from that. And the main thing here is natural cleave versus actually spending on AoE, right? So some classes in the game, and this is mainly melee specs, some melee specs have this just pretty good natural cleave. Some of their single target spells will still hit a lot of stuff around them. So this can be things like Windwalker Fist of Fury, Frost Decay, or whatever it can be that just passively cleaves, right? Fury Warrior. Now these classes are going to be pretty damn good at dealing with these AoE situations because once one of those AoE situations comes out, they can use, sure, maybe some of their AoE abilities, but also a lot of their just normal single target abilities and still do some really good AoE damage. While as if you're on a class that has to spend on doing AoE damage, then you're gonna lose a ton of single targets. So this would be stuff like Feral Druid, right? If you ferocious bite one mob with your combo points, that's gonna be a lot better damage effectiveness than just like trying to AoE with Feral Druid, right? The same goes for a lot of the casters. If you're an elemental shaman and you start dropping earthquakes instead of earth shocks, then you're going to lose a lot of single target damage. If you are a shadow priest and you start doing mind seer, right, it's going to also lose a lot of single target damage. So making sure to actually let the good AoE classes, the good natural cleave classes, deal with the AoE situations is really helpful for your raid. And sure, this is gonna look skewed on the damage meters, right? On the damage meters, the Windwalker monk could just pop Bone Dust Brew and spun for 10 seconds of all of those adds is gonna look amazing on the meters, but it is also gonna be incredibly helpful to you actually killing the boss quicker, because it means that no other class really has to spend a lot on that AoE, and you will gain a lot of single target. The next thing to talk about is defensives, and defensives can usually be grouped up into some different categories. We have personals, which is what I'm gonna talk about here. Those are the defensives that you can only use on yourself. Then we have externals. This is usually stuff that healers have, right? It's bark skin, it's pain suppression, stuff that can be used on other players as well as yourself. And then you have the raid cooldowns, right? Stuff like barrier, AMC. So when it comes to the personals, there's a few things to keep in mind. First of all, you should listen to your raid leader. If your raid leader is well prepared, or if you're doing very high-end content, it's very, very likely that your raid leader is going to want to use your personals in some very coordinated way, right? Because if there is an AoE going out that everyone takes damage from, if you know that everyone is going to pop their personal there, that means that it's very, very reliable to survive that bit of damage. And that means that maybe you need to save your personals for those kinds of things. Now, something that the raid leader usually calls, for example, is health pots or health stones. So if you know that you're going to need to use those on a specific part of the fight, then keep that in mind. Otherwise, you should personally recognize what spells in the encounter are going to hurt you and when are they going to do it, right? And this is something you need to either check a guide to know or just play the encounter. So when you know that one of those unavoidable damage things are going to come out and you're going to get hurt, then you already know that you need to preemptively press the defensive before that happens, and you will gain a lot of value. Another thing to keep in mind is to actually show up to raid with a lot of HP pots, right? I think a lot of players are not utilizing HP pots a lot. They're actually very, very useful. They do not share a cooldown with your stat pot. And the last thing about personals is to be liberal with them, right? Not every class has a ton of personals, so if you don't have a ton of personals, you might have to be a little bit more conservative. For example, hunters, pretty terrible personals there. But if you're something like a windwalker, a warlock, a paladin, something that just has a lot of survivability, then being liberal with your personals will probably be a lot better than holding them for no reason. Just blocking damage with a short cooldown personal is very, very useful. Now I wanted to go in a little bit more specific on your different roles. So depending on what role you are here, I will have some different guidance for you. If you are a melee player, then you probably have the easiest role in the raid, to be fair, because there's not really a whole lot you need to do. The biggest thing is to minimize downtime, and downtime happens when you're not in range of anything, right, as a melee player. If you can't press your damage spells, then you have downtime, and to minimize it, you need to think about your positioning, but the main thing is just to follow the boss around, right? And if you need to move out, you need to move out effectively. So, for example, let's say you get a pool on you that you need to move out with to a different corner of the room, then having your movement abilities for that move is obviously going to minimize the downtime. And this is the main thing to do to actually maximize DPS as a melee player. And it's also pretty much the only thing you do need to do. Now, you all obviously should also pool. And if you don't know what pooling is, it's just basically you stacking up on resources to do a lot of damage in a certain window. And I'm not talking about losing DPS here to pool. Like, you shouldn't sit at 5 combo points just spamming generators for 10 seconds. That is definitely the wrong way to do it. I'm just saying that if you have some sort of resource system where you can save a lot of it up, for example, on a DK, if you go into a damage window with both a lot of runes and a lot of runic power, then you're gonna do way more damage in that window than if you go in with tapped runes and tapped runic power, obviously. If you're a ranged DPS, it's a fairly similar story, but we have some different things to think about. Instead of minimizing downtime, most of range comes down to optimizing your movement, right? Because you are gonna have to move a lot in most of the encounters, and moving without losing DPS is how you optimize as a ranged player. So that means using your on the move abilities, so your instant cast spells, for example, when you need to move and not when you stand still. It also means to plan ahead for movement in the future, right? If you know that you're gonna need to move in 10 seconds, starting to move already is gonna get you a lot more DPS than standing planted casting, and then once you need to move, you're just like, fuck, I need to move. I run all the way there without casting anything. That's gonna lose a ton of DPS. This is essentially the same as minimizing downtime for melee players. It's just a little bit more difficult to do, and it's also why I think that ranged is usually slightly more difficult to play, especially on a just maximizing DPS level than melee, because in melee you don't really have a lot to think about with maximizing your DPS, while as in ranged you do have that optimizing of the movement every single global, more or less, right? So that also makes ranged very fun to play. I think that's why a lot of good players gravitate towards ranged classes. Now, I'm not saying melee is necessarily easier to play on a complete raid level, right? Because there's still going to be some mechanics that are tougher for melee, and you also have to move around a lot in melee while doing your rotation. So rotationally, it can still be pretty difficult to play melee specs. As a range class, you should obviously still also pool, just as you do on the melee specs. For example, this could take its form in an elemental shaman having a close to capped maelstrom bar when going into an add, or a Destrolock having 5 shards, havoc up when an add is spawning, for example. Then you have positioning, and positioning is close to optimizing movement, right? But positioning can be a little bit more important. For example, in some fights you want to stack the whole range group together. Sometimes you want to stack in melee with the whole range group, and sometimes you want to spread apart. There's usually something about the positioning in the raid fight, and depending on what fight you have, you're obviously gonna need to tweak this a little bit. But if you're new to the game, or if you just want some quick tips on positioning, usually it's a pretty good idea to just follow the rest of the range group, right? Maybe you even want to pick out one member that you stay close to all the time, that you just follow around. That is going to help a lot with just avoiding a lot of mechanics, especially if you are someone that is usually in the wrong position as a range player. Then this is maybe something you should think about. If you're a healer, then it's going to be a little bit more difficult for me to help you, because I haven't really healed at the mythic level ever, and I don't even think I've healed a lot in heroic raids. I've healed a bit in dungeons, but even then I'm pretty terrible. So the first thing to think about is overhealing, right? Healing is not like DPSing. It's not just going to be squeezing out every little bit of healing. That's not what healing is about. Healing is about conservatism, right? You need to conserve your mana, and it's about playing as efficiently as possible. So if you are usually overhealing, that means that you're wasting mana on nothing. You're also wasting globals on nothing. So if you are overhealing a lot, then you should definitely stop that right away. Then, this is gonna sound pretty stupid, but don't die as a healer. This is probably your biggest asset as a healer, because obviously you don't want to die as a DPS, you don't want to die as a range, you don't want to die as a melee, you don't ever want to die on anything. But as a healer, it's a little bit more important, I think, because first of all, there's less of you in the raid, right? So if a healer dies, it's probably gonna be a pretty massive detriment to the raid compared to if a DPS dies. Secondly, it's also a lot more common for healers to actually die, I think, because they have a pretty stressful job. They're usually looking at a ton of different unit frames on their raid, and they want to keep everyone alive. That means that they're spending less time actually looking at the floor itself or at the raid encounter. So usually healers die quite a lot, and if you are a healer that can consistently not die, it's going to be a massive asset to your raid team, and you're going to be very, very, very desired. Healers that don't die are amazing. Another thing that kind of ties into don't die is to be careful with AoEs and ground effects and stuff like that, because you are just looking at your bars, or sorry, not your bars, but your raid frames that much, right? As a healer, it's probably going to be pretty difficult to spot these mechanics most of the time. And there's a ton of different things you can do to spot AoEs more commonly, but the main thing is to go into your add-ons, and we're going to talk about add-ons soon, so don't worry if you don't know what I'm talking about here. But, for example, in bigwigs, you can emphasize certain abilities. So if you notice as a healer that you're dying to AoEs a lot, you're not moving when you should move, then just making a custom sound or emphasizing that effect that you're dying to might help you a lot. For example, this could look something like, if there's swirlies coming out on any boss, then making that swirly mechanic sound like, oh! For example, then you know that every time you hear "oh," then you have to move, and that's going to be very, very helpful when you're not looking at your screen. And the last thing as a healer is to do damage when you can, right? Because as I talked about before with the overhealing, you are all about playing the class efficiently. If there's no one to heal, then healing is going to be useless, and that's when you need to start doing damage, right? Because every little bit of healer DPS still does contribute to the raid encounter dying faster. Now, this is obviously going to depend a lot on which class you play. For example, if you are a Holy Paladin, Disc Priest, you will just naturally do damage in your rotation. But if you are Resto Shaman, Resto Druid, or something else, then you will have those times when maybe you don't have anything to do with healing, and you can start throwing a bit of damage into the boss. And finally, we're taking a look at the tank. So tank is again one of the roles that I have not played a lot at all, and I'm pretty bad at it. I have tanked raid a couple of times, but never on Mythic. The main thing here is also just don't die. The same reason as for the healers, right? You are only 2 tanks in raid, so if one of them dies, it's going to be a lot worse for the entire raid than if just like some random DPS dies. A common mistake I see some tanks doing is to call for heals, right? They are calling for heals, but heals are not really something you should call for, right? Heals come from two sources. Either you get passive healing from your healers, and those healers are obviously gonna do passive healing to you whenever they can. It's not something they can just suddenly do and they didn't do before because you suddenly started calling for it. The other form of healing is obviously healing you do to yourself. That's something you can manage yourself, and most of the survivability you have as a tank comes from yourself, right? It does not come from your healers. Now, there's also obviously going to be maybe some healer that is focused on healing the tanks or whatever, but the big thing here is that when you die, it is probably because of one of two reasons, right? Either you fucked up and you didn't play your rotation well enough, you didn't have a damage reduction up, you didn't have a cooldown up for something you should have had a cooldown up for, and that's your own fault. That's something you need to figure out yourself. Or you could not survive with the tools you had, right? You would have died anyway, even if you played even better. And in that case, you probably need an external. So that's what you should call for, right? Then, if you die to some mechanic that you couldn't survive, then you know that, okay, the next time this happens, then I might have to call for an external. Maybe you can even warn your healers beforehand that, hey, in this part of the fight, I'm probably gonna need an external. And then, once the time comes, you just key up in raid and you say, sack Björn, or whatever it is, right? And it's also important that you don't say, like, sack me, because probably it's going to be very hard for the people in the raid to recognize your voice. You should definitely always call your name or your character name when you are calling for stuff in raid. And the last thing to keep in mind as a tank is you should probably be prepared to be pretty damn bored. Tanking is pretty horrible in raids most of the time, and this can be for a few different reasons. First of all, the tank mechanics on most bosses aren't extremely inspired, so you might not have the most fun job. And since most of the wipes are probably going to come from something else than you fucking up, right? Especially if you play well, then the vast majority of wipes are going to come from DPS dying, or healers dying, or not enough healing, or not enough DPS. So that just leads to you being pretty damn bored most of the time, because you're just doing the same thing over and over again. There's nothing really you can do to impact the raid's performance at all. You just have to sit there and wait for other people to actually perform better. And that can be very, very hard to deal with. And this is where I want to go back to no tilting again, right? As a tank, it's very important that you don't tilt, because if you start tilting as a tank, then you're also going to have a very, very big detriment to the raid. When you start dying, when you start making mistakes later on, that really shouldn't happen. So with all of the performance out of the way, I wanted to move on to add-ons, and this can actually help you a lot in raid as well. So we're just going to go through the add-ons that I want you guys to pick up, and also what you can do with those add-ons to make your life easier. First of all, we have Bigwigs or DBM, right? This is the boss mods that is going to tell you all of the abilities that the bosses do. They're going to have timers, they're going to play sound effects at you and stuff like that. And this is really, really helpful for just raising your awareness to what is going on in any given raid fight. I'm sure most of you guys already have Bigwigs or DPM. I would personally recommend Bigwigs, but it's up to you at the end of the day. One thing you can do in these add-ons is to emphasize the mechanics that go on you. So there is a little checkbox in Bigwigs that says emphasize on self, right? So in that case, whenever the mechanic is on you, it will show up bigger on the screen, it will scream at you, it will tell you to do whatever it is you need to do with that mechanic. But if the mechanic is on someone else in the raid, it doesn't just scream at you all the time and make you stressed or make you think that you need to do something when in fact the mechanic is on other people. So that's a very, very useful thing to do if you find yourself struggling to maybe realize that a mechanic has even happened or that it is on you, right? In that case, you should definitely emphasize on self. The next thing is arguably even more helpful, but it has a bit of a caveat to it, and that is custom sounds. This is especially helpful if you are progressing the bosses for a long time, right? For a large amount of wipes. So this is mainly if you're in a lower end Mythic guild or if you're in a lower end Heroic guild, right? Where you might have multiple hundreds of wipes to any given boss. In that case, if you're like 100 wipes deep, then these custom sounds are going to become very, very, very helpful. And what custom sounds basically is that you will go into your add-on and you will assign different sounds to different mechanics. And add-ons already do this by default, but if you assign your own sounds to your own mechanics, it will be a lot easier for you personally to remember that mechanic. If you, however, plan on killing the boss fairly quickly, then this might not be as important for you, right? Because then you might not have enough time to actually learn the different sounds and to build muscle memory of them, so it might just be a waste of time. The second add-on I want you to download is Weak Auras, and this is also incredibly useful for other stuff in the game, but it's two main things in Raid. The first thing you should take a look at in Weak Auras is to just download a general Raid Weak Aura, right? And this is a Weak Aura pack that just covers all the different mechanics on all the different bosses. This is going to show you like buffs and debuffs in the middle of your screen. It's going to tell you if you have something on you, if you need to do something. It's very, very helpful for just not having to look at that stupid Blizzard UI, the debuffs and the buffs on the Blizzard UI, and you can actually raise your awareness quite a lot with this general Weak Aura pack. Then there's also specific boss auras, and this is helpful if a boss has a really involved mechanic that might be hard to solve on your own or on the fly. Fate Scribe Rockalo is a great example here. On Fate Scribe you will have those runes that you need to do, right? But you have a big list of people with a debuff, you don't really know who's going. There's a great boss Weak Aura list there who just tells your raid which people are going to the different runes and which runes they should go to. In that case, that will probably save your raid a ton of time to figure out that stuff yourself, and it will also just save you a lot of wipes because it helps with confusion. So if there is a good specific boss aura, you should definitely download it. Usually your raid leader will just tell you if there is something like this you need to download for any given boss. Then we have details, and here you can use Skada, you can use Recount, you can use whatever you want obviously, but I prefer details. The good thing about details is not the damage meter necessarily, but it is the other windows. And here I would definitely recommend you to, sure, you can have a damage meter, you can have a healing meter, you can have whatever meter you want that makes you have more fun as a player, but I would also recommend you to create more windows in details or whatever add-on you're using and look at, for example, deaths, damage taken, interrupts. Because if you do that and have those windows open at all times, it's going to be way, way, way easier for you to troubleshoot when something goes wrong. Let's, for example, say that a DPS dies and he doesn't really know what he died to, right? He doesn't know if he could help it, he doesn't know if he could have put a personal, or maybe if he was just in the wrong spot. Well, then you can instantly just mouse over his death in the details window. You can see exactly what he died to, when he died to it, what kinds of healing he got, what kinds of personals he used, and then it'll be very, very easy to troubleshoot what actually went wrong. Whereas if you don't have these windows open, then on every single death you're gonna have to go into your window, change the sorting, start looking through them, and it's gonna be a lot more confusing. It's gonna take a lot more time off of the raid. So I would recommend having a couple of these windows open. My personal favorites are deaths, first of all, because the one thing you're going to want to troubleshoot the most in raid is someone dying. Then you could also have stuff like just damage taken to monitor if you're taking an unreasonable amount of damage from stupid sources, right? If there's some ticking damage, some AoE that you're just not monitoring or managing very well, then seeing that you are taking a lot of damage and you're causing a lot of healing to have to go on you, that can be a pretty good idea. And if you, for example, have interrupts that needs to go out in the raid or whatever, it can also be a pretty good thing to just have an interrupt tracker to see which people are actually interrupting, which people are not interrupting. So at the end here, we're going to talk about what you should think about when joining a new raiding guild. And I think this is something we all can relate to. We're all a little bit nervous when joining a new raiding guild. We don't really know what to expect. We don't really know what the people in the guild expect from us, and we don't really know what to do in order to succeed. So I really wanted to help you guys out here with a few tips. Things you should focus extra on when joining a new guild, and now I'm talking like in your first raid, right? In your first trial raid with this new guild, you should focus extra on not dying. This is a number one thing, and this goes for every single raider in every single scenario, obviously, as I talked about with the healers, the tanks, even the DPS should never die. But if you are joining a new guild, if you're a trial, then this is extra important, right? It is not acceptable to die because you were greeding for DPS as a trial. That will stand out a ton. While if you are incredibly focused on not dying, if you just never die, even if you're going to be at the bottom of the meters, chances are no one is going to notice it, and if some people are noticing it, you already have a ton of excuses, right? You're a trial, you haven't really seen the bosses, etc, etc. And you should also focus extra on your attitude. You should prove to this new guild that you are someone who is responsible for your own mistakes, you have a good attitude, you don't flame people, and you're just trying to maybe keep a bit of a low profile while still being just a friendly and nice guy and accepting responsibility. Things you should not focus on while joining a new guild, and this is mainly just one thing. damage, right? You should not focus on topping the meters. This also goes for if you're a healer, right? Don't just go in there and think that, hey, I'm gonna fucking destroy these meters, because even if you somehow manage to actually top the meters here on your first trial, it is most likely gonna come at the expense of you dying a lot more than you should. And I'm just gonna be frank here, I haven't seen any trials ever topping meters while simultaneously not dying once, right? It's usually one of the two. It's usually either people being a little lower on the DPS but focusing on not dying, or people being a bit higher on the DPS but dying a ton, dying noticeably a lot, right? Keep in mind that you are at a disadvantage here when you're joining a new guild, and the new guild knows this, right? You don't have to feel bad about being at a disadvantage, because if the guild is a serious guild, then they should know that you are at a disadvantage when joining a new guild. This comes in a few different forms, right? First of all, you just simply have the least amount of practice, mainly in the raid, but also maybe as a WoW player in general, or whatever it can be. You are not used to the social dynamic of this new raid team, you're not used to the strats that they're using, so you're going to be at a disadvantage there as well. You might have to progress multiple different bosses, right? Because usually, if you're a trial, you might join on a re-clear night, or you might have to kill like 2 or 3 bosses to get to the boss you're progressing currently. That means that all of the other players in the guild have already progressed those bosses, they know exactly what to do, while as you are basically just first timing every single boss. And that is why it's so important to focus on not dying, because if you are going in there and you want to prove that you can do a large amount of damage on all of those re-clear bosses, but you end up actually dying a little bit more than you should because you want to do more damage, then that is going to stick in the minds of those raiders, right? If you are a Mythic raider that is currently progressing Mythic Painsmith and you're on a re-clear night and you're going through all of those bosses, if you have a trial who is wiping the raid 4 times over on eye because he can't dodge the beam because he's greeding, then you're going to be very tilted, you're probably going to dislike that trial, and the guild is also pretty likely to fail the trial because they see that he doesn't really respect the time of the other players in the guild, right? While as if a trial is actually going through all of those 5 bosses without dying a lot, maybe it's still fine to die sometimes, right? Sometimes you just haven't seen a mechanic, you don't know how to deal with it, etc, etc, that's okay. The kind of dying I'm talking about here is the dying where you are greeding to do extra damage or to do something clever or to do something fun or whatever it can be that causes you to die. This is extremely important to stay away from as a trial because, and I can speak for us personally as a guild, we have failed a lot of trials on dying a lot, we have failed a lot of trials on failing mechanics, we've failed a lot of trials on bad attitude, but very, very, very rarely do we ever fail a trial on bad DPS, right? And if we fail a trial on bad DPS, it's never going to be after the first raid night, right? We can fail a trial after bad DPS after like a couple of weeks when we are actually progressing a boss and we see, okay, this guy's DPS is just not up to par. That is when you can fail a trial for DPS, but no one is going to fail you as a trial for doing bad DPS on the first raid. Especially not if they're a serious guild, right? If the guild you're joining is a serious guild who wants to progress, who knows a lot about WoW, then you're never going to get failed for bad DPS on your first night. So don't worry about that too much. And one way to make sure that you don't die a lot is to play with margins. This is extremely, extremely useful, especially as a trial, but even as a core raider in a raid team, playing with margins can sometimes be very, very much to your advantage. Now, what I mean with playing with margins here is that you should not play on the edge all the time, right? You should not be 1 global from dying to a mechanic. You should not be finishing 1 cast and then moving out all the time, maybe, right? You should play with a bit of a margin, which means that even if something goes wrong, even if you misstep, even if you forget to use an ability, even if you're a little bit slow with reacting to a mechanic, that doesn't mean you're gonna die, right? Because you have preemptively taken that margin in to say, okay, I am gonna lose a little bit of DPS while doing this, but it's also gonna help me to not die if I fuck up. This can be stuff like, if you're on the eye, for example, and that beam comes around, even if you can jump the beam with an ability, maybe you should just, hey, I'm just gonna take the usual transport route with the chain across, even if I can skip it, because that is gonna reduce my potential of dying, right? Maybe it's not gonna reduce my amount of deaths. Maybe I'm actually a god and I will skip that beam every single time with my portal, but if I fail it, it's gonna have a very, very detrimental impact to my raid, and it's just not a risk I want to take on my trial night. So On my trial night, I might play very, very, very conservative. This is also stuff like finishing casts to move out of stuff is pretty risky. If you're a melee player, you might want to move out early with a mechanic instead of trying to squeeze out every single global and then jump out, because if you jump out too late, or if you jump out in the wrong direction, or if you jump out on top of someone else, or whatever it can be, then you are gonna be laughed at, you're gonna be flamed probably a little bit, or people are just silently gonna dislike you. But if you move out early and you lose a lot of DPS for it, sure, you're not gonna feel great, you're not gonna feel very optimal, but it's gonna help the good of the raid in the long term. And if you guys play with margins, something you will soon realize is that most of the pulls, you will actually end up higher on the damage meter than some other players, because of the simple fact that most people are actually dying at some point, right? People who don't play with these margins, people who try to squeeze out every little ounce of DPS, if they at some point fail, they're probably gonna die, which means that you will regain all of that DPS that you lost with playing with margins, and gain even more on top of that for not dying, obviously, and you're gonna end up higher on the DPS meters because of it. So playing with margins, especially if you're doing easier content, is never ever a bad idea. Something else you can do is to look up the bosses beforehand, right? This is especially useful if you know that you're gonna come into a re-clear night and that all of the other people in the raid have seen the bosses that you're gonna kill, but you haven't. Then it is very, very important to actually look up the bosses beforehand, but in that case, I would also advise you to not stress out too much about it, right? Don't try to learn every single fight. That is just impossible to learn every fight by just studying them without playing them. What you should do is to look at a guide for each boss, maybe quickly, and then think about the stuff that can wipe the raid from your perspective, right? So if you're DPS, this might be some punishing raid mechanic that if you fail it, everyone else is gonna die, right? This is, for example, the runes on Fate Scribe, or chains on Soul Render Dormacine, right? Stuff that you personally really need to make sure you're doing in order to not wipe the raid. Those mechanics are the ones that you are gonna look up and focus on and be wary of. If you are just wary of every single mechanic that can wipe the raid from your perspective, if you fuck it up, then you will also never ever wipe the raid, right? Because you will know all of those stuff. Sure, you might lose some DPS on other parts of the boss because you don't know some other mechanics. Sure, you might be confused when the healers are talking about something that you have no idea what they're even saying because you don't know the mechanics, but it doesn't really matter as long as you're not wiping the raid personally. So look up the bosses beforehand, but don't go too in depth. Just look at the very, very most important mechanics that can kill you or wipe the raid, and learn those and be aware of them. Another thing that's on a bit of a more philosophical level is to just keep in mind that regardless of the level of the players that you're playing with, regardless of what content they're currently clearing, most people in World of Warcraft just want to have fun, right? They just want to play the game and enjoy it. So if you are moving from a heroic guild to a mythic guild, from a normal guild to a heroic guild, or in any way, shape or form otherwise moving up on the ladder, right, then most likely the people that you're joining is not going to be that much different from the people you're leaving in terms of how they want to play the game. Now, they might have higher standards, they might be better at the game, they might do more damage, they might heal more, and they might be better at dealing with mechanics, but they're probably not going to have a totally different view on the game. They're not suddenly going to become way more serious. They're not going to do high-end Mythic Plus all the time. They're not going to be logged in every single minute of the week. They're not going to want to help you with everything. They're not going to want to talk through your class stuff. They're not going to want to talk to you all the time, right? They just have their own shit going on, and you're still in a raiding guild. It's just at a bit of a higher level. So don't join a guild and expect everything to change, right? That's not going to happen. It's probably just going to become a little bit more fun to raid. Maybe you're going to raid with a bit more skilled people, but it's not just going to be some massive shift. Now, obviously, there does come some shift the higher up you go, right? Once you go into world top 100 guilds, then you might start to see very, very large shifts in how people approach the game. But for the levels we are talking about here, for heroic guilds, normal guilds, and low-end mythic guilds, most of those guilds are just normal people having fun. And the last thing, don't be afraid to leave the guild if you don't get to raid, right? If you have a trial in a guild, you for some reason failed a trial. It might be because the guild is stupid, it might be because you fucked up, it might be because you died a lot, or you didn't do enough damage, or they just have too many of your class, or whatever it can be that means that you don't get to raid. Well, if you join the guild to raid, right, then you should just leave it immediately. You should not feel bad about leaving a guild where you don't get to raid in, because at the end of the day, the whole reason you're in the guild is to raid, right? There's nothing worse than joining a guild, realizing you don't get to raid, realizing you're just on the bench, and then sticking with it, expecting to maybe get some time later, or expecting that it will still be fun. The problem with this is twofold. First of all, you're not raiding, so you're probably not gonna have that much fun. You're also probably gonna be a little bit resentful maybe towards the other players or whatever because of that. And the main thing, in my opinion, is just that since you are not raiding, you actually won't really be creating social bonds and contacts with the other players in the guild, just naturally because you're not in the raids. And that means that you're just by default gonna become a little bit excluded from the rest of the players, right? It might be harder for you to make friends, it might be harder for you to find people to play with outside of raid, it might be harder for you to find Mythic Plus groups, and people might just not interact with you a whole ton because simply, why should they, right? They just don't know you, and you don't interact with them in any form of content that they're doing. So that means that you're gonna quickly become an outcast in the guild, and that is a very bad thing. That means that you will have even lower chances of actually getting into the raid team, you might have lower chances of getting into Mythic Plus groups or whatever, and especially if you then react to that by pushing further, right, by saying, hey, I want to do this, I want to do more content, why can't anyone do Mythic Plus with me, why won't anyone play with me, then that will also risk having the effect of pushing people even further away, right? Because most people in the guild are probably going to think, who is this new trial that is demanding our time and our attention when he hasn't done anything to earn it? And you might say, well, that's extremely unfair, I haven't even gotten the chance to raid, I should be treated better in this. And you do have a point here, but it doesn't matter, right? To the guild, it won't matter that you have a point. The best thing to do in that scenario is just to say, okay guys, I'm sad it didn't work out, I wish I'd tried harder on my trial, but I really want to raid, that's why I joined the guild, so I'm gonna look for something else, and then just leave. And that is gonna be really, really good for you, it's gonna be extremely good for the rest of the guild as well, because that's probably what they want, right? The rest of the guild who are failing a trial is probably expecting that trial to leave, since the whole reason they joined was to raid, right? It's pretty weird when a trial joins, they don't get to raid, and then they want to stay in the guild as some form of like semi-social, semi-raider. If you want to stay in the guild as a pure social, that's obviously fine, that's obviously great, but if you stay in the guild with the hopes of like eventually getting up the ladder, then I think you're just simply delusional, it's probably not gonna happen, and it's better for you to just look for another guild. Alright guys, that was a lot of information, but I hope you learned something about raiding, I hope you took something from this. Remember to go and watch the attitude section back maybe if you've already forgotten about that, because as I said, attitude is the one thing that you're gonna get kit for the most, it's the one thing that people are gonna dislike the most about you in a raid team, and it's also the one thing that is the very most important to the raid success as a whole. So definitely focus on your attitude first, and then start looking at minor things in your performance. Alright guys, at the end of the video here, I really hope you consider subscribing, leaving a like, because I'm gonna be releasing a lot of these guides, a lot of new content coming up shortly. Otherwise, I just hope you have a great day, have fun in 9.1.5, and I'll see you guys in a while. Bye bye. Huh? Oh, you're still here. Well, I'm sorry. I think you should probably go and check out a video maybe over here or somewhere here. You can even subscribe down here. That would be really, really nice. I would highly appreciate that. I'm gonna go snort some more lines. See ya.